you for joining us. And it's a great pleasure. I've already welcomed them and thank you for coming from Copenhagen to be with us. Adam and Martin, who are working at the Medical Museion, University of Copenhagen, and where have you moved to again?
I'm also at the University of Copenhagen, at the Department of Science Education.
That's right, yes. Science Education, that's right. I don't know why I thought you'd moved institution, but anyway, good. All right, so we'll let you kick off and tell us about the work you've been doing.
Great. So just one question. So there are 9 people online. The sound, is that going through the room?
There's microphones here.
So I won't turn on my microphone.
No, you should be all right. I think, can people online hear Martin? We could just, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we can hear you. Good.
All right. Hello, everyone. So many of you already met us, but I'm Martin, and this is. No, I'm sorry. This is Adam. We are from the University of Copenhagen. We've been working together for 5 years at Medical Museion before I moved to the Department of Science Education at the University of Copenhagen. And we want to talk about making metabolism public today, which is based on a lot of work we've been doing at Medical Museion, and that you've also been doing before I arrived 5 years ago. So Adam will give us a brief tour of the history of Medical Museion and how it is also interlinked with the Center for Basic Metabolic Research at the University of Copenhagen and how that work has been carried out. And then we've brought along 4 examples of more sort of current and recent work we've been doing, making metabolism public to showcase the different formats and ways of engagement. And Adam will talk about a big exhibition project called The World is in You. I'll talk about a much more small-scale experimental project called The Living Room. I'm also going to talk about sort of a collective dinner event that we hosted at Museion called Sensing Holobiont. And you'll talk about recent work with artists on metabolics art. And then we'll finish with some thoughts about what have we learned from these attempts to make metabolism public, and also some speculation around where to go next. So, yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. Cool. There we go. So, and what you said was, yeah. So that's actually Medical Museion, just to show you where it's at. It's on one of the main streets of Copenhagen, the old Royal Academy of Surgeons, but it's part of the University of Copenhagen as we're in a department under the Institute of Public Health, right? So we're a university department, but we are also this public space, and that's part of, I think, something we've over the years have been trying to make the most out of, being in this situation of being both a university department with university department obligations, but also a place where publics are and come to be. So it goes back to 1907. We have about 30 staff at the moment. We had 55,000 visitors last year, which was a record, by the way. So don't think that it's been like that every year. We sort of, our boss, Ken Arnold, who was our current boss, actually came from the World collection in London, calls kind of what we're doing, called it research in public, which is sort of, it's not that we sit and write our papers in glass boxes where people can see us, but it's this idea that actually the presence of audiences and publics in different ways throughout the research process changes how you do things, right? You change how you do your work. And we really try to create these sort of reiterative cycles between what we call both being research-based, but also being research-generating, or that through public engagement in different ways. I just want to do like a 2-minute story of the history of the museum to give you some context of why we've been working a lot with metabolism. So really quickly, that was the first version of the museum, 1907, was the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Danish Medical Association. You know how when professions get to a certain point in their history, they want to celebrate themselves. And this was one of those moments, and it was a great success, and it led to the establishment of the museum, which then had lived a sort of fairly active life from the mid-20th century onwards, 50s, 60s, and 70s, lots of activities. And then in the 90s, it was almost closed down. There was very little activity. It looked like this. I'm a museum person, so I have a great soft spot for these kind of very amateurish museums. But you can also see how it's kind of, fish tank aquariums with like things placed on the bottom of it and handwritten labels next to them. So very amateurish and not professional. But then from 2000 onwards, my old boss, Thomas Schütt, I began at the museum in 2000, and my boss, Thomas Schütt, began in 1999 and began a kind of reformulation of what the museum was supposed to do. And it really, one of the key decisions that was made in that time was to say, actually, everything that happens in the house should be about contemporary biomedicine. So we'll use all of the collections, we'll use all of the history, but we'll use it to contextualize what's happening in laboratories right now. That was partly a research interest of Thomas and others in the house, but it was partly also a strategic decision, because when the people from the medical faculty who actually pay the bills for keep the lights open come to the house, we thought it was important that they saw something which resonated with their current work, right? They could see there, and ideally also, as we've came to insist on over the years, that they saw something about their profession and their history and their science, which they themselves could not have made, right? So there was something different in that. That was a smart decision, also a very complicated one, because most of what happens in biomedicine is very difficult for museum work and for engagement work, right? So part of what we've had to do for the past 10, 15 years is to figure out ways of doing that and experimenting with that. We basically sold the idea of a museum as a kind of lab. So, you know, the medical funders didn't exactly know what, but they understood the language of the lab, right? So we said, that's actually, well, that's what we do at the museum. We are experimenting with knowledge there. And that also coincided with this interesting moment in science where science itself became less certain in some ways. From the past 20 years, there's been a kind of growth of ideas of complexity, of entanglement, of systems knowledge, of sort of a less certain metabolic science, particularly within metabolism also, which has allowed for, I think, more generative and meaningful encounters with medicine and with biomedicine in particular than probably earlier. And then in 2010, University of Copenhagen got a huge grant from the Novo Nordisk Foundation to set up a Center for Basic Metabolic Research. 100 million pounds was the initial grant, so lots of money. And Thomas, my old boss, managed to convince the then dean that we should use the LC model from the Genome Project to set aside 3% of that money to fund research in science communication. So part of the center should be a research unit for science communication, and that was us. and we've kept up that relationship over the years. So our relationship with metabolism was a kind of forced arranged marriage in the beginning. I had never thought about metabolism, and no one else in the house had. But then I think, interestingly, it turned out to be much richer and much more exciting and much more important than we had hoped for when we began this. But it means that the museum and lots of the people in it, myself included, I have a joint associate professorship in the center. So we're sort of, and then we've now been in that center for 12 years. So we really had long-term capacity to build relationship with basic biomedical scientists and work with them repeatedly and numerously and get to know their science and their work in different ways. Yeah, this is my last slide for this bit. Many, I think I've done 5, 6, 7, 8 exhibitions in the past 10 years on metabolic themes. We've commissioned artworks. We've done experimental projects. We've exhibited metabolic art, all kinds of things. And we'll now actually give you some examples of some of those many projects. I also can, if it's okay, I can sort of pat ourselves on the back. We've actually won several awards for this work, International Museum Works and stuff. It's just to say that you know, yeah, one doesn't get a lot of those, so everyone's so lucky to celebrate yourself and say actually that. But I think it is partly a recognition from the museum world that this work has a unique foundation. So that was like the ultra short history of our engagement with metabolism. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we'll skip this part because we don't have that much time, and we want to get into the examples. So we can talk more about the details around the concept of metabolism and so on, if that's interesting later. But yeah, 4 examples, and it's actually you again.
Oh, that's right. I'll talk briefly about this project, which is called The World is in You. It was a big research and engagement project, which you can see the dates up top of the screen. That was for the exhibition part. The project itself was a 2-year project. That means the world is in you. So it was a grant that was funded by a novel science communication grant. We didn't do it at our museum. We did it at a venue for contemporary art in Copenhagen, one of the central venues for contemporary art in Copenhagen. We wanted to capitalize on, well, what was at the time 15 years of work in art science experimentation. And instead of doing it in our houses where people were a different kind of audiences, we wanted to try to really take it to the heart of the contemporary art scene and say, here's some of the things we're thinking about and working with this. And it became this project. Huge rooms, 900 square meters. We had 27 different artworks and artists in the exhibition. We had 7 new commissions, 3 of which actually were collaborations between some of our PhD students and artists. So we put together our PhD students with artists and with scientists, and they made works for the exhibition. We had historical museums lending us objects, and we had objects from our scientific collaborators from the laboratory. So it's really kind of blended space with a kind of an insistence on combining art, science, and history in a shared space so that there wouldn't be an art bit and a science bit and a history bit, but all of those things coexisting in a shared space in a shared architecture. It's led to lots of stuff, including a book. If anyone is interested, I'll be more than happy to send either the physical book or a sort of a PDF of it and some of the thoughts that came from it. But it was really an exhibition it took point of departure in our engagement with metabolic science, which seems to us an interesting way is really to point to this entanglement and how complicated our embeddedness within the wider world around us and the environments we inhabit, ultimately planetary environments we inhabit, was something we wanted to work from. And then we ended up asking in this project what we call the reverse Anthropocene question. So if the Anthropocene question is sort of the question of what we're doing to the world, this exhibition asks, what's the world doing to us? Like, what's it mean to have a body that is entangled in this environment? And that came out of our work and thinking about metabolic science, which sort of studies this increasingly relational complex bodies with very deep epistemic constraints from biomedical sciences, which of course I spent the past 150 years sharpening tools to take things out of context. So the way we did it was we worked through 4 themes: time, space, microbes, and generations. And each of those themes was tied to a scientific research area. So time was about circadian biology, generations was about epigenetics, microbes was about microbiome research, and space was about space medicine. So kind of literally what happens when you take the body out of the planet. Nothing good. Don't go to Mars, even if someone says it's good, it's really not a good thing. Yeah, and so it's, as I said, it was a really big project, and I just wanted to show you 2 things from it to give you an example of the kinds of varieties of objects that were in it. These were objects from our own collections. These are made by medical doctors in the 40s and 50s at the ear, nose, throat department at the University of Copenhagen and the Rigshospitalet, the Central Hospital. And they were objects which doctors over the years extracted from the esophagus of patients. Oh, yeah. Right. So things people have been sort of choking on and swallowing on. And for us, it played a part in setting the stage of saying that, you know, the title "The World is in You" might sound like a kind of neo-hippie shared energy, we're all one kind of thing, but actually it's a statement that involves great inequalities, because not all bodies get the same parts of the world passed through them, and there's a great difference whether you live downwind from the chemical plant or not. And so it's sort of using historical objects to broach conceptual themes and ideas into this space. And so from that central space where there were lots of other things, people could then walk into the 4 different themes, and I'll just show you these 2. The thing on the left is a work called Co-Metabolize. It was one of the commissions we had for the show. Is an artist duo called Baum and Leahy. And the work was a shared set of tables built around this glass bulb in the middle, which had a living sourdough within it. And regularly throughout the opening of the show, bread was baked from that sourdough, and it was served ritually around the tables that you can see, which were images taken from the Human Cell Atlas, and what is suspended on the ceiling is images of the yeast genome and the honeybee genome, on the microbes that live. Sorry, the yeast genome and the honeybee microbiome that were kind of entangled with each other in spatial forms. Tons of other stuff to talk about, as you could probably imagine. The example on the right is a South Korean artist, Ji-won Woo, who did a work called Mother's Hand Taste, which takes a point of departure in this Korean concept called son mat, which means literally hand taste. And it's sort of cultural idea that you make something with your hands and there's a certain amount of kind of love and care and attention within that. But then, of course, particularly when you make fermented foods, that from a microbial perspective, then that entanglement becomes very real. The hand taste is actually a thing. And so she built a device, and actually the thing you can barely see in front of it is a device that's meant to extract the hand taste. So you can kind of actually make your mother's meatballs or her mattioli, as they were making in South Korea. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Yeah. So while the world was sort of a really grand scale art installation, art exhibition in the cultural center of Copenhagen. The living room that I'm going to talk about now was taking place in sort of the opposite kind of space. So a basement room at Medical Museion that wasn't usually used for exhibitions, and that we were allowed to take over to do sort of experimental work. That also meant that we could do a lot of different things and other things with objects than you would usually see at a museum. Yeah, so we were particularly focusing on trying to curate metabolic things, especially focusing on regeneration and decay. And it took place over also an expanded period of time, so 2 years where we had these experiments running. And we had the chance to really look at them develop, right? Yeah, so I guess looking back at the project, it started as a philosophical flirt for me personally with the concept of metabolism, and taking the task of making a metabolic collection almost too literally, and really wanting a collection that actually metabolized, actually was alive in certain senses. I then met Caitlin back in 2019, I think, and we started talking about how could you actually do that at a museum space, and you suggested doing a composting room, I recall, and it ended up turning into this sort of living room that then developed in a much bigger collaboration that I just want to show you the chronology of. And it's also a chronology of a collective in sort of an expanded sense, because as the project developed, a lot of other actors got involved, other people got interested, other microbes turned up, other things happened. So this is the chronology, and I've tried to take in everything. So please, if it looks weird, you know what. Yeah, so we worked in a transdisciplinary group with conservators, curators, artists, and researchers, and we sought to collaborate not just with each other, but also with other organisms. So more or less known organisms at the museum, like pink oyster mushrooms, waxworms, and different sorts of mold. And over time, this group developed, and especially within the expanded 2-year period, new organisms emerged that we hadn't expected in installations and so on. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But they also led to this living room and also kept the project alive, or what you can say. So in the basement room, we actually took over this basement space, and at the time it was already filled with objects that were sort of in the margins of the museum. So they were residing in the fringes, and we were allowed to work with these objects because they were not deemed valuable enough to be exhibited at the museum or part of the collection. And we started working in this sort of ambivalent, weird in-between space between value and waste, which is also sort of depicted on the nicely curated objects on the concrete floor, where they were also resting originally. With these things, we started to try to make metabolic things as sort of sites where organisms, environments, and objects got together in new assemblies and were sort of engaging in metabolic processes in different ways. So almost like cultivating metabolic encounters between objects, organisms, ourselves, and a curious yet sometimes also perhaps a bit confused public audience. And I'll just give you a few examples of what we've been doing down there. So this is the first example. This is called Archives. It was a work developed by Sarah Valle-Rocha, who was working in our AV collection and accidentally found moldy audio reels in the collection. And she started working, so it started as an archival work, trying to figure out what was actually in the archives, and gradually turned into an artistic project where she was also working with scale, trying to figure out, is there a way in which we can actually appreciate something like rust or mold, although they are sort of taking over our artifacts in the collections. And this is a photograph from her installation. So it was almost like thinking about, can we appreciate other things than just the artifacts, but also maybe something like eco-facts that points to, for example, the flooding of the basement at the museum in 2011. So that was one example. And the example is basically a way of sort of letting be and trying to appreciate other organisms. This next example is quite different because this is a much more actively engaged tinkering, trying to get organisms and objects together in new and unusual constellations. So it's a work called Slow Show and developed by Maria Branner, who's a sound artist. And she was working with the discarded books we found in the basement and trying to cultivate pink oyster mushrooms. And then made this installation that she called the Slow Show. And I think this title is just really nice because it really highlights something for me in terms of how to make metabolism public. And this idea that metabolism is sort of everywhere and nowhere. I think Landecker talks about this, but how do we actually show these transformations to people, to the public visiting, and when they come for 10 minutes, 15 minutes and look at this installation, nothing really happens, right? But then she worked with sound as a way to both try to explore the unusual boundaries and limits and differences and sort of the messiness of the growth of the pink oyster mushrooms, and also turning it into sort of a temporal installation, so people could actually listen in on the cultivation of these mushrooms over time. So that was that one. How are we doing this? So this next one is sort of my favorite example, maybe. So it's called Worm Door. And while the two previous examples remained rather docile and not too contaminating or anything, this one is really an example of what happens when you bring together heritage eaters, objects, medical objects, and artists in unusual assemblages. So the idea is to use waxworms, which can actually decompose plastic materials, to use them to decompose lab plastic waste inside this glass dome, which is called a desiccator. But what happened over time was that the worms died, and instead of the worms, the installation actually turned into a lot of other different things. So it started getting moldy. And then later to the right, you can see there's a microscopic image of sugar mites. So over time, sugar mites also appeared inside and also actually outside the installation. So over time, this installation became highly unruly, and we had to sort of box it within another level of boxes. And this is an example that was really concerning for the conservator, but also really engaging the public to see ourselves and the impossibilities to actually control even such a small environment, right? It almost became sort of a monument of our own failure to control environments. Yeah. So just to round off the living room, I think. So what happened in the living room, and how did metabolism sort of how was that involved? So I think metabolism as a concept in relation to this exhibition really challenged our sense of agency, as the credit list or list of collaborators shows. So the agency also changed over time. Although we inserted and cultivated certain organisms, there was always more than we could actually foresee. So it highlighted a multiplicity of flows and complexities, and also questioned the endings of, so when does this exhibition end? So it has ended officially, but I'm still trying to figure out what does these endings mean in metabolic terms. So that's the living room. And I'll move on to talk a bit about sensing Holobiont, flavorful rituals for metabolic companions. And this work is built on previous work that was showcased in The World is in You, co-metabolized by Baum and Leahy, together with culinary researchers Kim Weindorp and Joshua Evans, and a PhD fellow at the time at Medical Museion called Joanna Formasinho, and Professor Rob Dunn, and it was led by Louise Watson. So this experiment took place at Medical Museion as a collective dining encounter, and it included different sensorially stimulating elements such as wax cups, biomaterial cutlery, slime-filled pools connected by tubes, bubbling glass vessels, food and interactions between guests and guides, recipes that were also sort of poetry and so on. And just to give you a sense of it, I want to just show a 30-second video. Let's see if it's working. And if the sound isn't coming. All right. Yes. So many of you probably know the concept of the Holobiont, but just to clarify, so the performance was conceptualized around this idea of the Holobiont as an ecological unit of host organisms and associated microbes, viruses, and other smaller holobionts living on the host. So it sort of highlights a radical shift that not only are eating habits sort of embedded within culture and oriented towards human communion, but it's always more than human. Even if you eat alone, you're not really alone in that sense. It really invites us to think about sort of the flavorful complexities of being multi-species consortia. Yet more than just being about flavor, it is also literally about metabolism. So guests were actually eating as part of this ritual, and their metabolism changed during the visit and also afterwards, right? So we can maybe think about it in terms of Anne-Marie Moll and this idea from Eating in Theory that so the process of eating is actually the process of the world becoming part of me, right? And it really highlights a kinship between eating and being that you can also see in the Latin word esse, where they're both coming together. So eating and being is not just connected in the sense of I eat, therefore I am, but it's doing more to us than just keeping us alive. And just to round off this one, so Clémentine Delis in her book, The Metabolic Museum, has talked about how the museum is usually hostile towards bodies. And I think sensing Holobiont is a really good example of breaking these boundaries and really entering the bodies of visitors, not only turning into flavorful encounters, but also transforming their very makeup. And that brings us back to you, Adam.
One of my favorite parts of the Sensing Holobiont was that at some point during it was like a performance, so you kind of walk through. It took about an hour and a half, I think. But at some point of it, you got a piece of dough.
Yeah.
And you were you stood in a group of like 5 people, you were playing with your dough and you're talking, and there was a guy telling you about the dough. And then you then passed on the dough to the guide, and you were given some bread to eat. And then at some point after you've eaten some of the bread, and then you were told that the bread you were eating were made with dough from yesterday's performance. right? So you were essentially, and you had kind of been there with your hands on the dough, playing with it and, stretching it, doing all kinds of it. So there was a real nice kind of moment where you thought about what it means to be connected and not connected.
Yeah, it became sort of part of the exhibition ecosystem.
Exactly. Yeah, and and the kind of the way in which metabolism is about that weird balance between the necessity of openness and the difficulties of exposure and things. I'll just say three things. I just want to say one of the project we did last year was something called the Metabolic Arts Gathering, which I did together with my postdoc Hannah Storr Rogers. The idea was that we send out an open call for artists saying, do you want to, we want you to come to Copenhagen 6 times for a year to talk with us together as a group. There'll be no outcomes. There won't be a kind of, we'll make an exhibition at the end. It should lead to this thing. It's just bringing together people who think about metabolisms and have artistic practices for a year. And then that process is the outcome, essentially. So maybe that's one of the things which we've talked, I think, in particularly about through metabolism is refining and playing with and challenging notions of outcomes. As metabolism keeps going, you also then maybe become more aware of what processes do in a less kind of quantifiable way, but in real ways anyways. And we got like 110 applicants, I think, which was really nice, and ended up with this fantastic group of artists. Kathy High up in the corner, Bauman Leahy in the middle, cooking sections, Alon and Daniel. They are, by the way, a group for those who are interested in metabolic justice. Their art is basically metabolic justice art. Right? So they work with people and activists who challenge legislation around agriculture and access to food. He's done a lot of work on artificial salmon farming, for example. They did a show on the Tate Modern on that. Kira O'Reilly, a performance artist up in the right corner. Adam Dickinson, a Canadian poet who does metabolic poetics. And then Hege Tapio, a Finnish bioartist who, amongst other things, has made fuel with her own fat. And really, we're just rounding it up now. Hannah and I are interviewing each of the artists, and then we're writing some papers based on that kind of processual work and trying to think about the metabolic art. And it has been incredibly rich in thinking about both what it means to think about metabolism and through artistic practices, but also what it means to put processes into to do work on their own rather than through fixed deliverables and fixed outcomes. So Kathy's working with researchers at the Basic Metabolic Research, and Adam is having experiments done on his own body in different ways, and all kinds of things happened out of that processes. So out of that gathering. Yeah. So I don't know if we have exactly a sort of summation, but I think maybe some of the things which could be worth pointing out is that over the years, I mean, we became part of the center in 2010, so we thought about metabolism for almost a decade now. And really, I think the richness and potentiality of thinking with metabolism has become more and more clear. It seems the kind of advertising slogan version of it is that it feels like a very Anthropocene concept, because it allows for the stitching together of parts of the world which are often perceived apart, which then you can trace material connections through and about. It has created a lot of new openings for us to tell other stories about and physical material public engagement with different stories about bodies, health, and illnesses. And then it has thoroughly helped us explore what I'm here calling sort of awkward spaces. So spaces where no one is really on their best foot, or where people at least have to engage in conversations that are maybe slightly differently toned than the ones they normally have. Yeah, those are 3 points I'm doing there.
Yeah, sure. And maybe it's worth saying to the third one that it's not only disciplinary, right? It's also sort of creating actual spaces where the public are also engaged in sort of a slightly weird museum or some experiences that they wouldn't usually think about. So the final thing then is maybe to just think a bit about the future directions, and especially also in relation to metabolic justice that we are discussing today. So I think when I look back at our work, I think that we've been working a lot to try to bring the museum to life and also bring life into the museum in order to cultivate sort of a new sense of intimacy, a new idea of a new sense of how bodies interlink with the world in different ways, right? So in that process it hasn't just been about having topics about metabolism, but actually also trying to practice metabolism in certain ways, trying to develop a research and curatorial practice where we actually did metabolic things and instead of just highlighting the machinery to measure metabolism. So maybe there's something about cultivating some sort of ethos that makes us more sensitive to the flows and circulations and exchanges that span from these tiny mushrooms in medical books through our bodies and out into the planetary world, planetary home that we have. And I think three tentative interests then materialize for me. And I must admit, it's more like sort of midnight musings than daylight realizations. So the first one is this one. So how can we cultivate metabolic sensibilities in broader context than the museum? How can our ways of practicing metabolism go beyond the museum space? For example, in local communities, bringing people more in touch with local biologies and environments that shape bodies and health, maybe crafting some sort of material interface for metabolic belonging. And on a global scale, also maybe becoming more aware of these unjust or dissimilar local biologies and the unequal inscription in bodies and inequities. So that's the first one. So the second one is, how can these sensibilities perhaps lead to a heightened sense of porosity of our very existence and our responsibility, not just for our own, but also planetary health? So how can our own focus on health also have a more expansive side to it? And third, can we craft these material interfaces that cultivate an attentiveness to the dynamics and vulnerability of matter that may lead to political action and new forms of transnational and transcorporeal justice? So that's sort of very proclamatory and big, but we can discuss. Yeah, so that's it, I think.
Thank you. Thanks for those questions. If that's what you get up to in the night time, then very useful for reflecting. Brilliant. So let's have plenty of time for discussion. I think we're going to eat a little bit into our program, but that's fine. But any questions or? Can I just ask about you? You mentioned at one point, Adam, that sometimes, or maybe it was Martin, the slightly confused public.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's the risk, isn't it? But I mean, I just get any sense of how you thought about or done any research on how people responded to this, whether or not they go away with these kinds of ideas or projects. And
so I think so that was me mentioning that, and I think so the space we were working in was sort of a basement, and there was something about the smell and something about the dust and something about the experiments that was sort of transgressive, so that it was definitely something around disgust, but also curiosity. So, and I think that's also what's exciting about metabolism and about this idea of being intertwined with the world, that it can both sound like this hippie thing, but it's also a contamination. That's the risk of contamination, right? And I think I saw both in the public responses. I didn't do any research on the visitor experiences, but I did give tours each Fridays for a year and a half, I think. So I saw a lot of different responses. And I think one of the most powerful responses was probably one younger girl, maybe 12, 14, who seemed almost allergic in her reaction to what we were doing. And I asked her if she was okay or if she needed to get out. And it was actually sort of just overwhelming to see these mushrooms entangled in places where they shouldn't be. So there's definitely something also in the sensitivity to metabolism that can both be sort of this romantic idea of, oh, we are one with nature, but it also has this darker side to it. So I think it's almost like we cultivated sort of a darker ecology as well around that.
Maybe, and I think one of the important things we've learned also over the years in relation to the publics is that there isn't a right way to do it, right? There isn't a particular mode which is the right one. You know, the world is in you was a big, you know, sort of much safer space in some ways than that, and audience responded to that in different ways, and that gave some audience in, you know, access to these topics in ways that the experimental part of it maybe wouldn't have, and so like we've come to focus on process in new ways, I think we've also come to focus on evaluation in new ways, because is it better to have 10 people in a space with a really intense experience than 5,000 people who click on something on the internet, like, or people who go through the door and pass out 10 minutes later? Is that, you know, what's the how do you evaluate the qualitative nature of those encounters? And I don't think we had learned much besides that there is a great reason for doing many different things on many different scales in many different contexts, and that is part of how you engage with metabolism in good ways, I think. We did a lot of visitor studies in the world as in you, and really my colleague Kristen and Louise did a lot of work on that and trying to figure out how audience responded to their meeting with science in that space, but also how they responded to the mixture of art, science, and history. And happily, they responded very positively to exactly that part of it, that it was a mixed space. So it resonated with audiences.
I'm very struck by the both institutionalized and the history of engagement with the microbial world is often one of eradication or you know, kind of something we definitely need to not engage with anymore. So it's just kind of.
But oddly or interestingly enough, I mean, we've done a number of projects on the microbial, and the idea that we're entangled with microbial worlds and that we have to take care of them resonate hugely with audiences. You don't have to convince them of that, because I think it resonates with a larger set of questions about what it means to be part of the world, which comes to be expressed very literally in microbial ecosystems, because here is someone saying, actually, the world is in you, and it ain't a metaphor. You know, it's 1.5 kilos of stuff that lives in you.
When you've got the objection associated with eating dough from somebody else's,
Yeah.
I just gotta,
it's complicated.
yes.
At Fiocruz, we also have a museum, but dedicated to scientific dissemination. And it's very close to many favelas around Fiocruz and poor rural populations. So usually we create a joint space between Fiocruz and community. And we have many experiences about arbovirus and other health problems with them. What you're presenting, it's a bit different. So how you can be more sensitive and creative about this. So I think in the project, we can have some communication or dialogue with Museum of Life in Fiocruz, right? To try to do something not the same, but how we can be connected and how we can have more scale about this public metabolic representations or different representations or social representations of metabolic in different settings. So I think it could be a good idea, right? And one of them, the current director of Museum of Life is Ana Carolina. She was here for PhD sandwich for 1 year with a colleague from somewhere here in the department of art or history or something. Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that could be. Yeah, and so congratulations! It's a fantastic work. I would like to visit the exhibition, not online in person. It's very vivid, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, really fascinating presentation, really fascinating
Yeah.
exhibitions. It's incredible. I would love to go into those as well. So a couple of questions. Firstly were there installations or objects or entities that you'd wish you'd got in but you couldn't, or other kind of installations that resisted inclusion actually, so they didn't do, or they died off, or they didn't go how you wanted them to go, and so you removed them?
Yeah.
So
I could give one example of that, which was that some of our collaborators, one of our research collaborators, Manny, he's a microbiome researcher. He has an apparatus called a SYMPOSIUM, which is basically an artificial gut. So, but it's just like a series of bottles in which you can sort of function as a kind of proxy for the human gut. And so you can take samples and you can feed it different foods, and so it's basically a machine that makes poo, right? That's what it does. And so we wanted that whole machine in the world is in you, and he was like, yeah, that's not going to happen because they had like biohazard markings all over the laboratory, so they were so the thought of taking that. But then we played around with actually just taking. We had a series of bottles, but they were of course cleaned and which was. But we actually tried putting in some of the slurry that would be in there normally, but it wasn't possible it would contaminate the rest of the space in different ways. So that's a kind of one thing which we wanted to do, but good.
So I think working with the discarded objects, there were definitely also things we had to let go just to get to the others, right? And I think that's also about sort of heritage. Actually asbestos. So we had a dental oven that was sort of showcased for quite a while in the exhibition until a conservator from another museum identified it with asbestos inside. So we had to remove that quickly, right? So it really shows that sort of managing trash is actually a real issue, not just in this tiny space, but that's definitely sort of a toxic heritage to take into account. And then maybe the weird flip side is that actually having certain medical instruments that were just so well built that we couldn't break them down actually. So for example, we had a PCR machine, a big gray one where you can sort of, and I tried to figure out what plastic was made of, and the company wouldn't tell me. So we couldn't really figure out how to deal with that. So I think it's still going strong, and we'll probably be doing that for quite a while.
And maybe a final point also to add to that, I think one of the things which goes back to the idea of the process that we talked about, that actually one exhibition about metabolism won't be able to contain it all. So actually the capacity to do things at different scales and different formats and different audiences is actually becomes part of the point that because some things just have to be one person talking to 10 people in a room with nothing, and some things have to be 900 square meters and 27 artists, and that diversity is part of mirroring something about metabolism rather than trying to imagine that you'll be able to get all of it in one space.
Can I ask a question? So just because there's a, for those of us who are thinking about a project in this area, there's that kind of turning point of metabolism becoming undone. It's moving from the doctrine of conversion to a kind of unraveling of what these processes might be. A lot of what you're talking about is was conversion, wasn't it? I suppose, and I suppose this is crucial for thinking how this might translate to urban Dakar or wherever. Is that we need to think how you engage people with that unraveling process, or maybe I've just, the way I've interpreted lots of your examples, it felt they were quite about digestion, conversion, energy, and
I think one of the things which I think is important, which we've thought a lot about over the years, one of the things that happens when you start thinking about metabolism is that it becomes everything. Right. That it really becomes everything. So to sort of figure out how to deal with that, we've sort of had this sort of, okay, so our take on this will be that we will try to have a sense that there is something in the world that's metabolism and something that's not metabolism. right? So it's do a kind of work. And then those things that aren't metabolism might be connected to or impact the things that are metabolisms. But there's also a sense in which there is a set of biochemical processes at the heart of this thing. And metabolic attention has to also be aware of all the other stuff, but also have to be attentive to the molecular biological changes that happen, right? So that a metabolic attention doesn't become a metaphor for connectedness or another way of saying things or entangled, but actually saying, no, there is something we can change. And then you can interestingly trace how those biochemical processes work and how they change and the kind of things they impact in the world. But that I think has been one of the ways in which we try to manage that that problem. And then in the world as in you and other shows, maybe because we're part of a medical faculty, we keep coming back to the human body. That's our anchor. And then we show that body as not the thing we thought it was and not the bounded thing we thought it was, and something that's also microbial and there's also all of those other things. But that's our way of kind of giving the audience something that keeps recurring, some that kind of anchors the thinking about it.
Oh, yeah. You want me to read it out, or can you see? So this is from Alessandro. Unless you want to speak it, Alessandro, do you want me to read it out for you? Okay, I'll read it for the time being, and then you correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you for this incredible talk. I was wondering about the use of the term metabolic justice. Could you maybe expand on it? What do you think this term encompasses, and how would you say it can be implemented? Thank you again. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Yeah. Alessandro, maybe you have the answers, but why don't we ask Adam and Martin?
Well, you also you can also answer this question.
Increasingly not.
Yeah, maybe that's part of it. But I mean, given that that the post-industrial health landscape is characterized by metabolic deterioration, by metabolic processes that in different ways lead to disease states, then thinking about metabolism is also a way to think about how resources are distributed and which bodies get to eat which foods and how the foods we eat are made and what the impacts of those processes are and the justices and injustices that that come from that entire system that in different way fuels or doesn't fuel different bodies. So it's I think metabolic justice is trying to create a tension where there's something about how bodies work that is tied into systems of resources and resource distribution, and that is one of the a crux. It has always been historically one of the important parts of how humans have navigated their environments, but also increasingly becoming so in particular ways that says something about how the world is right now, that we hope to speak to. That was like as big as it got, but yeah, we're trying to formulate what it means.
Yeah.
I think, Alexander, the other point is that because of the context within which those processes it takes place is changing chemically, hormonally, kind of in terms of our environments and so on. There are changes to metabolic processes that also contain uneven elements that we need to work out and also work out ways of collectively addressing, I think. I don't know if that answers your question. It'd be interesting to know whether it did or not, because if it didn't, we're really struggling. But hopefully it did.
Well, brainstorming, right? Just how we can represent other magical rationalities. There is a very strong research group in Brazil focused on magical rationalities.
Magical.
Medical.
Oh, right, medical. All right. I was getting excited about magic.
Yeah, magical. Could be. But how different magical thinking can represent metabolism, like homeopathics or Chinese medicine in different cultures, I think could be very interesting to explore. because the concept of energy or something can change in different epistemologies, right? So
I think
not
the-
to
In a way,
compare.
there is a medical system that doesn't have
Yeah.
some kind of relationship to energy, food,
Yeah.
and what it means.
Yeah.
And also historically, it's such a big part of
Exactly.
of how Western medicine also and other forms of medicine developed.
Because the West and European thinking lies or dominate a lot of the thing.
And drew in from the other way.
Yeah. Once you say something different, well, you're wrong.
Mm.
It's not scientific proven. So the indigenous tradition about medicine is completely different, and there are many options and
think-
examples about
This is one of the critical points about the epistemic
it.
justice in this, is that opening up those possibilities, and certainly the Patel and what the two authors, the book on inflammation, for example,
Yeah.
which took information from the Asian tradition, if you like, and use that as a kind of key way of thinking through, well, the inflaming of the world, but also the inflammation associated with immunity and metabolism, which was quite useful. But I think you're right, that seemed to me a key part of metabolic justice in some ways, is thinking, especially you put up the wonderful obesity map, which I always use when I say the world's it's complex.
I love it.
But that's a key moment, isn't it? To say actually, well, this opens up the space as well for listening differently to other kind of traditions, I think.
Yeah.
Any further questions or points from? Great. Well, I'd like to thank you again for putting that together and telling us about, and of course, congratulations on all the work and awards. Fantastic. Yeah. So we could probably just have a quick 5-minute break, and then the